Espinola, who is a Republican candidate for the state senate, second Essex Middlesex district.
Correct.
A resident of Dracut, lived here in a while. Lived here about 16 years, but I guess let's start. It's good to tell people beyond just living here for 16 years and being the Dracut representative on the Greater Lowell Tech School Committee, you've got some deep ties here in Dracut. Talk a little bit about the family ties here in the community.
Yeah, so, and it's fun, we had talked a little bit about this earlier. My uncle, the gym at the high school is named after my uncle, Paul Merrill, and he was the town moderator here for a number of years until he had passed away from cancer. But I recently have seen some pictures way back in the early 1900s of school committee meetings and city council meetings that have been conducted in my uncle's basement. So that's how far back they go. They didn't have a place to meet, and they would have the early meetings in my uncle's basement. He had a long a serving area or like a breakfast bar, and people would go down there and they would spend hours upon hours solving problems for the people of Dracut. So my grandfather and my uncle, they were plumbers, and they pretty much all the old buildings in Dracut, they did all the plumbing in all the buildings. And so I have two families that are from the town of Dracut. There are O'Briens and Merrills, and that's my family. They were teachers, principals, elected officials. They were born and raised in Dracut. My dad just asked my mom to move to Lowell to be near his parents because they weren't well, and so they moved there, and that's why I was brought up and I was raised there for. Moved out of there when I was 24. I moved to Tingsboro, and then I moved back to Lowell when I became a police officer at 27, and I was 35 when I got married. Then I moved back to Dracut shortly after we got married.
Excellent. So, as I mentioned, you're presently the chairman of the Greater Lowell Tech School Committee.
Correct.
You've opted not to seek re-election to that position this fall to run for state senate. What prompted you to make that decision that this was the right time to run for a state legislative position?
Well, it was one of those things that early on when the person who holds the seat now was running, it was an open seat left by Barry Feingold, and I had contemplated that at that time, and it was around the same time where I was making a decision whether I should run for the Greater Lowell School Committee or I should run for state senate. And at the time, I'm a graduate of Greater Lowell School Committee, Greater Lowell School, the tech school. I graduated in 1983, and there was some things that were going on politically, in the newspapers, that just didn't jive with me, and I figured that they needed somebody who came from that school so that they could add a new perspective to what the school means from the inside out rather than the outside in. They had a pretentious superintendent hire that went a number of rounds, over 200 rounds before they decided that they had to put it back out. I believe 212 rounds.
Wow.
And they put it back out to bid, and they got another superintendent. I don't know how many rounds over this, but it was always a fiction of the newspaper that the stories that were going on about the school that I loved was me. So I chose to run for the school committee instead of state senate. And,
I see.
And so, it was something that I was interested in early on. And as you know, in politics, when somebody's been in a spot for a while, they tend to garner some support and some likeliness from the district. And
they get entrenched.
Yes, it's tough to beat an incumbent.
Sure.
Let's be honest. So I decided that when Barbara was leaving to seek a seat in Congress, I said, you know what? Here's a time where I can I can use my experience with education, my experience with just growing up. I grew up in a neighborhood in Back Central in Lowell, to try to make a difference than what is going on right now. I think people have become complacent with their politicians, and now's a time where people are now starting to say, you promised me these things when you got elected,
Right.
and you're not doing what you said you were going to do.
Right.
And I think that it's time for a change. I think it's time for a rethink of the district and the way that they think of things, the politicians in the state of Massachusetts. And we need to even up the score. And I'm not typically, I mean, I just registered as a Republican a few years ago. I've always been unenrolled.
I see.
But to me, it seems that there are two, it's a Democratic state. Let's face it, it's a Democratic state. And it's hard to have a balance of what people believe in. Because although people that get out and vote democratically, doesn't mean that it's a Democratic state. I believe, and I call them couch voters, that they've just given up, that they don't vote. And I think what we need to do, when you have 30% of the people who are registered to vote that are coming out to vote, there's 70% of the people, this is on average, it's not...
Right. Oh, no.
You know what I'm saying. 70% of the people who are registered to vote don't come out and vote.
Right.
Why?
Right.
And I think if you give them a reason to vote, they'll get up and vote.
Right.
So that's what I'm hoping for.
You are a retired Lowell police officer. So you worked in Lowell a number of years. You lived in Lowell a number of years. Lowell, not unlike Lawrence, is part of this district, 2nd Essex, Middlesex. What do you feel like your background as a police officer would bring to your role as a state senator?
Well, particularly in this district, there are some issues that are going on right now in Lawrence, specifically, that my experience would definitely help to try to make a difference with these issues that are happening. As I said earlier, I am a product of Back Central Street, and you get out of Back Central Street two ways. You either went in a box or you moved out. Unfortunately, my brother didn't make it, and I did. So my brother passed away at 45 from addiction. So addiction to me is a personal, it's a personal thing for me. I know people that are struggling. I have family members that are struggling right now with addiction. And I grew up in a bad environment in Back Central. It was very, very difficult. There were gang turf wars. There were things that I consider myself lucky to have made it out of there. Wasn't always the way. When we moved there, it wasn't as bad as it was when I left. And I can say that definitely, because when I moved in there, it was an Irish turning Portuguese neighborhood that you could eat off the streets. People just took care of their stuff. But you still had the drug problems. You had the gang wars that were going on in the South Common, the North Common, and things got pretty dicey at the time. Now I spent 4.5 years at the Department of Corrections in Concord. And then after that I left and I went to the police department. Now the whole time I was at the police department, I spent in family services mostly, with domestic violence, the gang unit, juvenile unit. I've run court programs for kids, the juvenile detention program. We also have programs that were first-time offenders that would allow kids that had just minimal crimes, that if they completed this program, they were able to have their record expunged from the court so that it wouldn't be on their record. So with that, with my family services stuff, which